Think back to December 23rd, 2022, Buffalo, New York. The city is doing what it does best in the days before Christmas, moving. Store windows are dressed in lights. Families are wrapping final gifts at kitchen tables. The radio plays carols. Snow is expected, sure. Buffalo always expects snow. But this isn't the story of an inconvenience. This is the story of something that would trap thousands, test the limits of survival, and remind an entire region what happens when nature decides the holiday is over. By the time people realized what was coming, it was already too late to leave. This is the story of the Buffalo Christmas blizzard of 2022, a storm that didn't just close roads. It turned the city into an island, stranded families in their cars, and forced neighbors to become the only lifeline between survival and tragedy. The week before Christmas in Buffalo isn't unusual. It's routine. It's expected. Tom, who worked at a hardware store on Main Street, had seen 6 blizzards in the past decade. He knew how to stock shelves with salt and shovels. He knew how people panicked. And he knew, or thought he knew, that by Christmas Eve the roads would be clear again, just like always. His daughter Sarah was home from college, sleeping in her childhood bedroom. She'd made the drive from Rochester 2 days earlier without a second thought. The weather forecast showed snow, maybe 8 to 12 inches. Manageable, typical. Her mom had made a roast waiting in the refrigerator. On the news, meteorologists were talking differently than usual. There was something in their tone. The wind wasn't just wind. The lake effect mechanism, the way Arctic air rolls across Lake Erie and sucks moisture up in towering columns, was going to be particularly active. But the numbers they gave were presented almost casually. 8 inches, 10 inches, maybe a foot near the lake. Nobody said, by Friday some neighborhoods would disappear in whiteout conditions. Nobody said, a woman named Patricia would sit in her car for 12 hours without heat. Nobody said, the thing you think you understand about winter is about to betray you completely. At the airport, departures were still listed as on time. At the grocery stores, the bread aisle looked normal. People weren't running. They were shopping like it was any other pre-holiday day, maybe buying a few extra things, but without the panic that comes when you truly believe something is coming. Mike, who drove a snow removal truck for the county, had his equipment checked. The salt hoppers were full. The plow blade was sharp. He'd slept that night knowing he'd be working through Christmas Eve, and he'd made peace with it years ago. This was his job. This was what he did. He didn't know yet that his truck would become a beacon of hope for stranded motorists, or that he'd work for 30 hours straight without coming home. The Thursday before the storm, the mood in Buffalo was anticipatory but calm. Christmas was still a vacation. The blizzard was still just weather. It started Friday afternoon, around 2 p.m. By 3, the snow wasn't falling. It was being driven. The wind came from the northwest at speeds that would reach, and it carried snow so thick that drivers on the thruway could see maybe 20 feet ahead. The first accidents happened quickly, not dramatic crashes, just cars losing grip, sliding sideways, drivers suddenly unsure which way was the shoulder and which way was the median. By 5 p.m., the state police started closing roads. The thruway eastbound near the city, then westbound, then the side roads that people tried to use as alternatives. What had been a working network of routes became a maze of dead ends. Cars that had been on the road at 4:30 were trapped by 6 o'clock. The snow was already 3 feet deep in some places, and it was still coming. Sarah called her mum from her car at 5:45. She'd left Rochester at 3 o'clock thinking she could beat the storm. She was wrong. She was somewhere on Route 90, visibility maybe 50 feet, and there were cars ahead of her just stopped, not parked, stopped. She could see brake lights floating in the white. "Stay in the car," her mum said. "Turn on the heat. Stay in the car." Her phone was at 68% battery. By 7 p.m., the power grid was failing. Transformers were exploding under the weight of ice and snow accumulation. Not fire-bright explosions, but sudden blackness followed by a moment of quiet that felt like surrender. Neighborhoods on Buffalo's south side went dark. Then the east side. Thousands of houses had heat that was powered by electricity. Thousands of people didn't know yet that they needed to find alternatives. Patricia, who lived alone on a tree-lined street in South Buffalo, had kept her car parked in the driveway. She'd meant to move it to the garage, but she'd forgotten. By 7:30 p.m., she decided to sit in the car instead of the house. The heat worked. And the house didn't anymore. She brought a blanket. She brought her phone. She didn't think about what happens when a phone battery dies, because at that point, you don't believe it will matter. By 8 p.m., the emergency services network was overwhelmed. Calls were coming in from every part of the city. People trapped in cars, people in homes without heat, people in medical emergencies with no way to reach a hospital. The 911 dispatchers were speaking in controlled voices, but there was an edge underneath that control. They were running out of units to send. Every ambulance was committed. Every police car was on a call. The snow wasn't stopping. It wasn't easing. It was becoming something apocalyptic. By 10 p.m., the highways had completely stopped trying. Not the vehicles on them, those kept moving, slowly, desperately, but the infrastructure had surrendered. Salt trucks couldn't make progress because the roads were being filled as fast as they were being cleared. Visibility was near zero. The wind was now a constant force, pushing cars across lanes. Sarah had made it maybe 3 miles in the last 3 hours. She was in a long line of cars, tail lights visible maybe 20 feet ahead through the static of white. The heater was running, and she kept thinking about the gas gauge. She'd been thinking about the gas gauge for the past 20 minutes. Tom was watching the news from home. The television reports were starting to shift from bad storm coming to catastrophic conditions. The words they used were whiteout, paralyzing, historic. He was wondering where Sarah was. He tried calling. No answer. He tried again. Still no answer. He told himself the call would go through later. By midnight, more than 50 people had lost consciousness in their cars from carbon monoxide poisoning. Some were revived, some weren't. Some were discovered the next morning by rescue workers. The snowbanks had grown so tall that rescue workers couldn't see cars until they were almost on top of them. The hours between midnight and dawn were the hours that people would remember for the rest of their lives. Not in the way you remember a movie or a story, in the way that certain moments are tattooed onto your nervous system so deeply that years later just the sound of wind on a winter night brings it all back. Sarah's car was at 32% battery. She'd turned off the heater 15 minutes ago to conserve gas. The blanket she'd taken from her dorm room was wrapped around her shoulders. She was shaking, not quite violently, but constantly, a tremor that had worked its way into her bones. The car ahead of her had its brake lights on, but nothing was moving. She didn't know if the driver was still inside it. She didn't know if the driver was alive. She thought about her mum's roast in the refrigerator. She thought about how stupid it was to think about a roast when the temperature outside was, verify, approximately minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. She thought about her phone dying, and she made a decision. She wouldn't call anyone else. She would save the battery. If something happened, it would be because something happened, not because she ran out of power trying to reach people who couldn't help her anyway. The car's windows started to ice over from the inside. Humidity from her breathing was freezing on the glass. The world outside became completely invisible. Mike, the snow removal driver, was in his truck with another operator named David. They'd been moving through the city methodically, not trying to clear the highways anymore, just trying to reach stranded people. The thruway had been closed completely at 11:47 p.m. Anyone still on it was on their own. Mike and David had found the first car around 1:30 a.m. A man named Carlos was unconscious in the driver's seat. Mike broke the window, pulled him out into the snow, a contradictory moment where the cold was actually the thing that might save him. They got him into the truck and drove him to a hospital, only to find that the emergency room was already overcrowded with other people in the same condition. "How many more are out there?" David asked. "I don't know," Mike said. "Keep driving." By 3 a.m., the city had transformed into something that didn't look like a place where humans lived. The snow was so deep that normal landmarks had vanished. Fire hydrants were invisible. The distinction between sidewalk and street had erased. The city was a white plain, undifferentiated and absolute. Patricia was still in her car. Her phone was at 8%. She'd been inside the vehicle for 9 hours. She'd been rationing the heat by running it for 10 minutes. Then turning it off for 5. The cold was becoming personal. It wasn't distant anymore. It was in her chest, making her breathing shallow. Her hands were numb, not painfully numb, which would have been better. Numbly numb. She kept flexing her fingers to make sure she could still feel them. Sometimes she could, sometimes she couldn't. She thought about texting her sister, but what would she write? "I'm cold" felt absurd. Everything felt absurd. The reality of dying in her own driveway in a city, surrounded by houses, seemed so statistically improbable that part of her mind was still convinced it wasn't happening. She was just tired. She would wake up, By 4 a.m., a new crisis was forming. The temperature was dropping further. Pipes in older homes were freezing. Furnaces that should have been warming houses were inadequate or non-functional. People were opening their ovens to provide heat, which meant carbon monoxide in homes, which meant more emergency calls. The hospital had activated its disaster protocol. The National Guard had been requested, but they couldn't mobilize quickly in conditions where vehicles were trapped on highways. A woman named Margaret, who lived near Elmwood Avenue, had made the decision to walk. She had 3 children, ages 4, 7, and 9, and their apartment complex had lost power at 8 p.m. The landlord hadn't responded to calls. The temperature inside was dropping visibly. After 2 hours of waiting, she decided they would walk to her mother's house, which was 6 blocks away. 6 blocks. In normal conditions, a 15-minute walk. In a blizzard at 2 a.m., a navigation problem without a solution. She put coats on the children. She put scarves around their faces. She carried her youngest and held the middle child's hand. Her 7-year-old had instructions. Hold on to mommy's coat and don't let go. And the wind was the worst part, not the cold, which was already difficult, but the wind came in gusts that would actually push them sideways. She lost the street multiple times. She was navigating by memory and by feeling the sidewalk edge with her foot. The snow was up to her thigh. The children were crying, not loud, just small, shuddering sounds that were almost worse than loud crying. When they reached her mother's house, a brick building with a porch light that had somehow stayed on, Margaret collapsed on the first step. Her mother opened the door and took them inside. Margaret couldn't speak. She was shaking so hard that her teeth were clicking together. Her youngest child was unconscious, and for a moment her mother thought, but no, he was breathing. He was just asleep. Margaret would remember that walk for the rest of her life. Years later, she would still have a specific fear response to wind. By dawn on Christmas Eve, something shifted. The snow had stopped coming quite so aggressively. The wind had eased slightly. The visibility improved from 0 to merely terrible. And something else shifted too, something in how people responded. The bars and restaurants that still had power became ad hoc shelters. Denny's on Main Street opened its doors to anyone who needed warmth. The owner, a man named George, kept the coffee coming and didn't charge anyone. When supplies ran low, he called restaurants he knew in neighborhoods that still had electricity. By 7 a.m., his place was warm and full and alive in a way that made people cry. People remember the nurses who walked to the hospital through the blizzard because they couldn't call in sick. They remember the firefighters who worked in conditions where frostbite could set in within minutes, knowing they were going to be out there anyway. They remember the volunteers who started without any official coordination to knock on doors in their neighborhoods and check on elderly residents. Tom walked to his daughter's apartment, not the one she'd driven from, but one she'd rented near Canisius College, to check if she'd made it. He walked 4 miles through waist-high snow, stopping occasionally to orient himself by memory. When he got there, the building was dark. The door was locked. He stood outside in the cold and called her number again. It rang, and he felt something break in his chest. Then she answered, just barely. Her phone had 2% battery. She was still on the thruway. She was in her car. She was alive. Honey, I'm walking. I'm going to walk to you. Dad, no. It's not. I'm already walking. It took him another 2 hours to reach the section of highway where she'd told him she was. He'd marked the odometer in his head. He knew the roads. Her car was where she said it would be, buried under 2 feet of new snow. He dug around the driver's side door with his bare hands until he could pull it open. Sarah stepped out, and he held her. She was crying. He was crying. The wind was still pushing them both around like they weighed nothing at all. They didn't try to drive. They walked together, back toward the city, back toward home. Mike and David kept driving. They found Patricia at 7:15 a.m. Her car windows were completely opaque with ice. Mike broke the window like he'd broken Carlos's window hours earlier. Patricia was conscious, but barely. They got her into the truck, and the warmth of the cab made her convulse with shivers. How long? Mike asked. I don't know, Patricia said. 12 hours, maybe more. I stopped counting. They took her to the hospital. The emergency room looked like something from a war film. People covered in blankets, IV lines, oxygen masks. A nurse met them at the entrance. and took Patricia inside without a word. Mike and David went back out. By noon on Christmas Eve, the roads were still impassable, but the worst intensity of the storm had broken. People were starting to emerge from their homes, from their cars, from the places where they'd sheltered. Neighbors who'd never spoken to each other before knocked on doors, checked on each other, shared supplies. A church in South Buffalo served lunch, soup and bread. It wasn't traditional Christmas dinner, but people came, and they sat together, and something in that sitting together was itself a kind of celebration. Margaret and her children were dry and warm. They were at her mother's house, and her mother had made tea with honey, and the children had stopped shaking. Margaret was sitting by the window, watching the street, which had started to look like a street again, instead of a landscape from another planet. "Can we go home today?" her youngest asked. "Not yet, baby," Margaret said. "Soon. We'll go home soon." But she wasn't sure that was true. She knew the apartment still had no heat. She knew that going back meant choosing cold again. For now, she chose to sit by the window with her tea and her children, and not think about what came next. If you have a story from the 2022 Christmas blizzard, whether you were stranded or you helped someone, or you just remember that day, please share it in the comments. These stories matter. They're how we remember that we belong to each other. Like and subscribe if you love stories about resilience and survival.